Thank you. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Nikolaus Krygis-Kurtek, who comes to us from the Columbia University. And Nikolaus bridges the work between deep neural networks and the brain with attempt to actually to build that open bridge that we have seen earlier in the talks. And another thing is that I would like to add that he co-founded Cognitive Neuroscience Conference, which is a special conference that bridges both computational and cognitive domains. And I look forward to the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Nikolaus to the conference.
Thank you, Tanya. Wow, what an amazing set of talks. It's so great to be here. I'm happy we're having this symposium. So recently, we've had a lot of our wishes granted in the sciences of mind and brain. We got much better ways of measuring neural activity and behavior in humans and animals. So we can measure with array recordings and neuropixels and also imaging techniques in both humans and animals brain activity in much greater detail in space and time. And we also have scaled up behavioral experiments online in humans, and we have video tracking for capturing animal behavior and human behavior in much greater detail. And we have the tools now with neural network models to really analyze these data. So that's one amazing technological revolution. And then there's been another revolution, which is about the modeling of neural networks, neural network models revolution, where neural networks finally delivered on their old promise in AI applications. And all the hardware and software developments in this context, of course, provide great tools for us. So one perspective is that we've had our wishes granted. However, we haven't really figured out how to relate these two revolutions to each other. They're beautifully complementary in that these much richer models that have millions or billions of parameters require much richer data for model identification. However, it also means that our science has been disrupted by these two revolutions, and we have to find our feet in this new reality. And the discipline that I consider myself a part of could be called cognitive computational neuroscience, and it emerges from these two revolutions. Tanya mentioned the new conference called Cognitive Computational Neuroscience, which was initiated by Thomas Nasalaris and Kendrick Kay, and Ralph and I were also involved in the founding of this conference. And the idea of this conference is to bring together cognitive science and computational neuroscience and sort of merge these two fields into a single field, where the primary explanandum is cognition. So we want to explain how cognition is implemented in brains. We're not sort of interested in neurons for their own sake, but in how they interact with each other to implement cognitive processes. So we could think of it as cognitive science grounded in neuroscience, or we could think of it as computational neuroscience growing up toward cognition and finally making that sort of step from smaller circuits and simple computations all the way up to primate intelligence and human intelligence. And critically, computation has to be in the middle there, because computational models, and these new neural network models especially, form the bridge between cognition and its implementation in brains of humans and animals. My title today is Neural Network Models as Mechanistic Explanations of Brain Information Processing. So it's a little bit of a philosophical talk, and it's mostly about problems, because I don't think cognitive computational neuroscience is a mature discipline. I think because it's new, these technologies are new, we have to reinvent our methodology, and we do not at the moment have a mature discipline, unfortunately. This is work in collaboration with two brilliant postdocs, Tal Golan and Heiko Schütt, who are professors now in Israel, Tal at Ben-Gurion University and Heiko at the University of Luxembourg. So a lot of these ideas emerged in discussions with them while they were in our lab in New York. So neural network models as mechanistic explanations. I'm sure there are some people in the room to whom this sounds completely bland, because neural networks clearly are mechanisms. They can implement cognitive functions, and they are models, so they're mechanistic models, right? What's the problem? However, among actual neuroscientists and a lot of my colleagues at the Zuckerman Institute, this is controversial. Why is it controversial? Well, there are mainly two arguments against it. One is that these models are too simple to provide mechanistic accounts. And the second one is that they're too complex to provide explanations because they have millions or billions of parameters. So you might think, if some people think they're too simple, other people think they're too complex, maybe they're about right, they're sort of in the middle, and maybe all is fine. But that would be a little too facile, because you can argue that they're too simple in one way, in that they're not faithful to biology, and they're too complex in another way, not intuitively explainable or mathematically analyzable. So they could be too simple and too complex at the same time, or in other words, just wrong in a way. And that leads to a third criticism, which I think deserves to be taken very seriously, which is that what we're doing with these models is just data fitting. These models are universal function approximators, and when they're recurrent, they're universal approximators of dynamical systems, so they can sort of, by fitting all these parameters, you can capture anything. So what hypothesis are you really testing? So one response to this is to focus on small circuits, for example, in small animals or on sort of small pieces of the primate brain at a time, where we can have biologically more faithful models that we can still analyze and understand. However, this doesn't work for people like me who want to study high-level perceptual and cognitive processes. So for primate cognition, we will need models with millions or billions of parameters to represent the knowledge that is necessary for intelligence, as I think the history of artificial intelligence has really shown very clearly. So we have to engage these really complex models if we're ever going to tackle primate higher level cognition. But we have these issues to deal with, and they're not easy to address. And I would like to try to make the case that we have a shot at interpreting these models as mechanistic models, even though it is actually problematic. So when does a model capture the computational mechanism underlying some cognitive task performance? I'm going to propose that to capture a brain computational mechanism, a model must be cognitive in the sense that it must perform some cognitive task or component computation. It must be mappable in the sense that the model components at some level of abstraction must correspond to brain components. And it must be generalizable. It must be able to predict far beyond the training distribution. And this third point is absolutely key, and I think sometimes not emphasized strongly enough. So when we're testing brain computational theories by experiment in the age of big data and big models, what does this look like? We have different kinds of data. We have world data, we have brain data, we have behavioral data. And one way to think about this is as funneling the information from these different sources of data into the parameters of the model. So when we think of it like this, it's really somewhat inescapable that we come to think of it as a kind of high parametric curve fitting. The model serves as an approximator. Training and testing uses the same data modalities and distributions, so we might test on an independent test set, but that independent test set is drawn from the same distribution, so it's only within distribution generalization performance that we're evaluating. And in this setting, distinct high parametric models are hard to adjudicate among as brain computational models, because each of the models is going to be so flexible that it can account for the data quite well. And you're going to see a couple of examples of this later on. However, there's also different games that we can play with our our data and with these new models. So here's one that's popular in cognitive computational neuroscience. In this game, we fit the models just with the world data and the behavioral data, and we use the brain data only to adjudicate among different models. And the models can differ in their architecture or their objective or their training diet. So in this context, we can perform inferential model comparison. We can train on ecological constraints, for example, natural stimuli and task requirements. We can test on brain activity data, which poses an out-of-distribution generalization challenge because in this setting, the models have not at all been fitted to brain activity data. They've only been fitted to perform the tasks. So the models implement competing computational theories, and the theories are at a more abstract level than the models themselves with their millions of parameters. The theories relate to the abstract description of the models in terms of their architectures and their objectives and their learning rule. When I think of a model, I think of it as an isomorphism of two homomorphisms, right? So we're ignoring a lot of details of this biological thing between our ears, and we're also ignoring a lot of the details of our physical simulation of our neural network model. And it's only at this abstract level of description in our minds that we can have this one-to-one correspondence between the model and the brain. So an important question to ask is, what should those abstractions be? What is the right level of abstraction at which to look to model information processing in brains? Zhao and Yamens have used this term predictively adequate runnable abstraction, where runnable means the same thing that I've called cognitive, that the model can be run and it performs some task. An important caveat here is that it's possible that we need two different levels of abstraction for the cognitive function and for mappability. So, for example, we might need all of these parameters, all these connections in a model to be able to do visual recognition, but that doesn't mean that the correspondency between two models or a model and a brain will be at the level of these individual parameters, right? And that, I think, disconnecting these two things is something that many of us are deeply uncomfortable with, and that's something that we should think about, whether we still want to think about these models as mechanistic or have a different term for them. Of course, when we compare two different human brains, we also don't have a neuron to neuron or synapse to synapse correspondency, right? So we need to embrace the fact that any correspondency has to reside at some more abstract level of description. Neuroscientists have built a number of different descriptive abstractions for the purposes of analyzing data and trying to make theoretical progress. But I think we should keep an open mind. There's many things we could consider there. So some decisions with respect to the abstractions that we should employ, we need to decide on a spatial scale. Should it be at the level of neurons or regional means? A temporal scale? Do we care about spiking or just about rates? And also summary statistical description. Do we care about local responses? Do we care about representational geometry? Do we care about the decodable information? We have a set of tools, but it's also, in another sense, quite wide open what the right tools are. Ultimately, we would like to drive theory with data, but a challenge is that theories are separated from data by multiple indeterminacies. So each theory can be implemented in a number of different models, and each model defined by architecture, objective function, and learning rule can be implemented in multiple instances when you train the same architecture with the same objective and learning rule from different random seeds, for example, or with different random samples of stimuli, every time you get a completely different set of weights, it might have a similar performance. So we want to think of it as implementing the same algorithm, but it is, at a very detailed level, a completely different model. And then when the models are stochastic, as they should be to implement things like probabilistic inference by sampling, for example, then also each trial of presentation of an image is going to be different. And finally, we have measurement noise, so we have all of these challenges. And then, as if that weren't enough, we're facing a version of the induction problem where we can't really prove or even meaningfully assign probabilities to theories or models because these models are very expensive, so we can never be on top of the prior distribution over all possible mechanisms, right? That's a pipe dream, and I think we're back in the kind of scenario that was discussed in the context of the philosophy of science, and we're drawn back to Popper and Lakatos for some guidance of what to do in this situation. I think some of their ideas are still relevant there. So we love probabilistic inference, and we should use it as much as possible, but it's not a panacea for all of our induction needs. So the idea is, the hope is that model comparison can drive model improvement. We compare the evidence for different models. We can look at likelihood ratios, for example. We prefer models that make stronger predictions and are better corroborated. And we generate new models to explore the space of possibilities and hope that we're inching toward better and better models for some sort of part of the space of cognitive function. So there's a sea of problems, and I've outlined some of them. So in the remaining time, I want to talk about some sort of baby steps in my own lab toward solutions to some of them. And the first is about model comparisons. How can we develop inference methods that generalize to new subjects and conditions for evaluating these models with brain and behavioral data? And the second is about experimental design. And this will be about testing models out of distribution generalization performance, because we want to test them as mechanistic models, and their ability to generalize to different stimuli is key to that claim. And the other element of this is that we want to design our experiments, and in the context of vision, we study vision in my lab. We want to design the stimuli so as to get the models to make contrasting predictions. So that's sort of the obvious thing that scientists always do, but it's not obvious what those stimuli are when your models have millions or billions of parameters. So in terms of model comparison, we've been developing this framework of representational similarity analysis. We're presenting sets of visual stimuli to the brains of our subjects and to our models, and then in a given brain region or layer of a neural network model, we get one activity pattern for each of the particular stimuli. And this raises the question, how can we compare these representations? One very important approach is linear encoding models, and that's a very powerful approach that we use in our lab as well. But another approach is to describe these representations at the level of their representational geometry, where we're looking at the space spanned by the neural activities. So there's one dimension per neuron, and each response pattern to a stimulus is a point in the space, and we can characterize the representation by the distances between these points, which reflect the discriminabilities of the stimuli. And it's also characterizes the geometry of the entire set of points. So for example, when you have the distance matrix, you know what dichotomies of the stimuli can be linearly or non-linearly decoded. So we can characterize representations in brains and models with these representational dissimilarity matrices, or RDMs, which are indexed horizontally and vertically by the stimuli, and they're straightforward to compare to each other. However, we need to do this statistically, of course, and we may still want to fit parameters to our models, and in order to avoid bias of fitting, we need to do this in cross-validation. So we have a subset of fitting stimuli and a subset of fitting subjects, and then we use these dissimilarities, so of these representational dissimilarity matrices, these blue components serve as the fitting data, and then we test the models in terms of their performance on different subjects, on different stimuli simultaneously. So the models must generalize simultaneously to different subjects and different stimuli. So this gives us unbiased estimates of the performance of each model, unbiased by overfitting to either the subjects or the stimuli. So those performance estimates that we would expect to generalize. However, it doesn't give us our uncertainty. So we also do bootstrapping of both the stimuli and the subjects. And there are some interesting statistical challenges with this approach. But we've worked this out, and we can do model comparative inference using this two-factor cross-validation and two-factor bootstrap approach to avoid overfitting to either subjects or stimuli, and to treat both subjects and stimuli as random effects, so as to generalize with our model comparative inferences to the respective populations of subjects and stimuli. So model comparison gives us bar graphs like this, where we see the performance of each of the models at predicting the representational geometry of a brain region. And we have these bars at the top that I call Golan wings, where you see which other models each of the models significantly dominates. So this model here dominates this one and these two here. There's a tick mark for each it dominates. So these comparisons are really key, I think, to drive theoretical progress. And also this noise ceiling, which has an upper and a lower bound, gives us an estimate of the range of performance in which we would expect the true model to fall if the true model were one of our models. But usually the true model is not part of our models, because we cannot possibly be on top of this prior over all possibilities. And that's also why the noise ceiling is so important. Another way to visualize the same information and some additional information is in terms of what we call the model map, where the data representational dissimilarity matrix is at the center. The noise ceiling becomes a noise halo. The best performing model is plotted straight above the data dot by convention. And then all of the other models are plotted on orbits, such that the distance to the central data RDM exactly reflects the performance of each of the models, and the angles at which they're plotted approximately reflects how similar their predicted RDMs are. So this gives a little bit of additional information to this one. Here, the order of the models is conventional. This is just the user gives them in this order. Here you see them follow the progression, because these predicted RDMs are actually more similar between the first two convolutional layers than between the first and the third, for example. So the second point is experimental design. So how can we design our experiments in order to be able to adjudicate powerfully between these different models? So Golan in the lab has focused on this problem and developed what we call the method of controversial stimuli. Tal's first insight was that to elicit models' distinct inductive biases, we can test the models on a population of stimuli that was not used in training. So these are out-of-distribution tests. So for that purpose, we could draw natural stimuli from a different category, or we could make synthetic stimuli. That would also be an example of out-of-distribution tests if they have not been used in setting the parameters of the model in any way. And then the second important insight was that since our goal is to adjudicate among models, we can create synthetic stimuli optimized to elicit distinct predictions from different models. So these are stimuli that are controversial among the models, right? So that's the meaning of controversial. It relates to adversarial stimuli. It's related to adversarial stimuli in that these are model-driven optimized stimuli that reveal shortcomings of models, but controversial stimuli generalized adversarial stimuli in that they're controversial between two models, whereas an adversarial stimulus is a stimulus that's controversial between one model and the ground truth. So here's an example of a study where we didn't use controversial stimuli and how that can lead us astray. We wanted to explain human face dissimilarity judgments, so we used the Basel face space model, which is a computer graphics 3D model that describes faces in terms of latent vectors that describe the shape in 3D of the faces and the texture components, and you can combine these hundreds of dimensions of latent features to generate faces and then render them in arbitrary lightings. And we wanted to study human dissimilarity judgments, so we got this large touch screen where we presented people with pairs of faces and we asked them to drag and drop them such that they would place very dissimilar faces toward the top and very similar faces toward the bottom, and identical faces here at the very lowest part. So this is ratio scale face dissimilarity judgments. And then we had a bunch of different computational models, including image computable models, simple visual features, neural network models, but also the latent representation in this computer graphics model that was the basis for generating these face images. And when we compared all these models to the human face dissimilarity judgments, we found that there were a lot of models that came very close to the noise ceiling and weren't really significantly different from each other. So we had these 7 models here. Some of them are image computable, VGG, these are neural network models, LXNet is in there, GIST, and then 3 different versions of the subsets, all the latents of the Basel face model and the shape and texture components. So we couldn't tell the difference between these really very different models of the representation. Why can't we distinguish the models? We think that despite distinct mechanisms, the models make similar predictions for natural or synthetic faces when these faces are not chosen expressly to discriminate the models. So this is something that many people have struggled with recently. Mechanistically distinct models can predict biological visual representations of natural stimuli equally well. So here's some examples from different modalities of measurement, behavior, human fMRI, human ECOG, and also primate behavior and electrophysiology for faces and non-face stimuli. So this is a real problem. So we tried to design a set of faces for which our set of models would make contrasting predictions. How did we do that? We had this set of parameters that defines an entire stimulus set of faces, so many faces. These faces can be rendered with a differentiable 3D graphics engine, PyTorch 3D. This gives us face images, which we presented to all of our neural network models. And then we get from the neural network models, from each of their layers, the predicted dissimilarities, and we define a controversiality optimization objective. So this is a Bayesian optimal experimental design approach where we have a utility that we're measuring that reflects how well we can discriminate the different models. And then we use gradient-based optimization because all of these components are differentiable to simultaneously and jointly optimize this entire set of faces for adjudicating between the models. So here's the results, and we use randomly sampled stimuli, and here's a bunch of different models. They all use the VGG architecture, but very different objectives. And the top one here is an inverse rendering model that is trained to map back from the images to the latent variables in this graphics model that generated the images. So when we use randomly sampled stimuli, we have very limited power to discriminate these models here. The same is true when we use systematically sampled stimuli that are designed to be sort of spread out in the space of faces. And when we use controversial stimuli, then we have a clear winner in this case, and it's the generative inverse rendering model that wins. So that speaks to some of the earlier talks that highlighted the need for generative components in models of primate vision. Ralph already showed you this generative adversarial collaboration that we started in the context of the Cognitive Computational Neuroscience Conference. So this is all about ordering our thoughts and sort of talking to each other about what I see as one of the most important tensions in theory in vision between generative and discriminative computations. And we have sort of proponents here of opposite viewpoints. And you can see that several of them are here. Ralph is here and Doris is here. There's no little representation of the discriminative perspective. Maybe we need to engage them separately. Or maybe there are some in the room that we can get to say more.
What color is Nico?
Nico keeps an open mind. So discriminative is all about learning a model that maps from images to, for example, category labels or whatever latent variables that describe the inputs are behaviorally relevant to the animal. And generative is about learning a richer representation of the entire distributions associated with each of the classes in the sort of simplest case. So we want to learn the joint distribution of the input images X and the labels Y. There's a deep relationship between the process of generation and the ability to generalize. So generation and generalization are in a very fascinating relationship. They share the same Latin root, genus, which means birth, origin, class, or kind. Generation, I think we can say, supports generalization. And this is a very intriguing fact to me. We can have different kinds of generative model, for example, models that can generate samples. We can have models that are statistical generative models, so probabilistic models, or we can have causal generative models, and we can have different combinations of these features. So there are models that are all of these, there are models that are just some of these. And when we can generate samples, we can create novel instances, and that's part of the fascination with generative AI. That's a new kind of machine that never existed before. We didn't associate computers with the ability to create new content, where there's all this unexpectedness and surprise in the outputs, and there's no sort of definite solution, and that's the fascination of it. And the same process also helps us understand and behave successfully in novel environments for the same reason. So this is incredibly intriguing to me. That's why I was very excited to see that this symposium is focusing on the generative mind. So here's another example where we used controversial stimuli to test generative and discriminative models. And these were models of perception of handwritten digits from the MNIST data set. So we can, for a given model, we can look at two digits like 3 and 7, and here I'm plotting the probability assigned by model A to the digit being a 7 minus the probability assigned by model A to the digit being a 3. So this is the contrast for model A, and I can use the other axis to plot the contrast for model B so that I get 4 quadrants, where in these two quadrants the models agree, and in these 2 quadrants the models disagree. When I look at the original MNIST digits, they fall far into the corners here because all the models can correctly classify all of these little hand-drawn digits, and they will classify them correctly, just like all of our subjects. So it's obvious that it wouldn't be very useful to do a behavioral experiment with subjects classifying these digits, because all the subjects and all of the models would behave equivalently. However, we can start from a random image and then drive these models into agreement. And this involves defining a controversiality objective, which in this case required that one model is very confident that it's a 7 and very confident that it's not a 3, and it's vice versa for the other model. So then we get these ambiguous stimuli here. I'm German, so I see a 7 here. So I guess my perception agrees with model A in this case. And we call this a controversial stimuli. So Tal contrasted a number of pairs of models, and these were feed-forward and recurrent and generative and discriminative models. And for each of the models, he could generate many stimuli. So for example, this one would be perceived as a 6-by-shot analysis by synthesis. This is the shot analysis by synthesis model. And it would be perceived as a 3 by the Gaussian kernel density estimator model. And when Tal did this for all pairs of models and all pairs of digits, he got this large set of stimuli, so a really rich set of probes that highlight the differences in the predictions of all of these models. And that gives us the power to really adjudicate among these models. And when we did these comparisons, we found that there was one model, the shot analysis by synthesis model, that significantly dominated all of the other models. And when we looked at the top 3 models here, they were all generative models. So here the 4 quadrants, feed forward versus recurrent, generative versus discriminative, and all the 3 best models were, had generative components in them, some generative aspect to them. We also applied this approach to test the limits of language generative models for predicting human language judgments. So the task was like this: which sentence is more likely to be encountered in natural English? So you see 2 sentences, and the subject would pick one of them as more likely to be encountered. So subjects can make these judgments, and language models assign probabilities to English sentences. So we can compare them in terms of how well they are aligned to human judgments. So in order to make this more intuitive, you can think of the space of all sentences as a discrete probability space, where a given model like BERT has some probability distribution with high probability and low probability sentences, and another model like GPT-2, so this is a very old, this was a few years ago, this is not a modern large language model, this is sort of the not the state of the art. When we look at it like this, we see there are some sentences in sentence space that both models agree are unlikely, and some part where they agree that the sentences are likely. And then these other regions here are controversial, because one of the models thinks that the sentence is likely and the other thinks it's unlikely. So in this experiment, we started from natural sentences, and then we did discrete, greedy optimization, changing one word in an 8-word sentence at a time and considering to replace it with every word in the dictionary in order to take steps in this discrete space of sentences so as to reduce the probability according to GPT-2 while keeping the probability according to BERT at least the same, or vice versa. And so here are 2 examples. We started with the natural sentence, "This is the lie, you have been sold." And when we reduced the probability according to GPT-2, we got, "This is the week you have been dying," which is perfectly grammatical, but it's a little weird and not very likely to be encountered in English because it doesn't make a lot of sense for someone to say this. And when we reduced the probability according to BERT and kept it the same according to GPT-2, we got the sentence, "That is the narrative we have been sold," which is a perfectly natural English sentence that I'm guessing has been uttered many times. So when we evaluate these large language models, here's the chance level, here's the noise ceiling. Just to confuse you, it's a better performance is on the right in this case. Each of these dots here is a replication of the experiment using new subjects and new stimuli. So we had many replications built into this in order to be able to do the statistics correctly. So this is the picture you get when you use random natural sentences. The models are really hard to distinguish, despite the fact that some of them are really very simple probability models that don't do anything sophisticated at all. When we use controversial sentences, then we really have a lot of power to discriminate these models. We get many models significantly failing, falling short of the noise ceiling. And this is for natural sentences from the corpus selected to be controversial. And this is for the synthetic controversial sentences that were generated by discrete optimization. So here we can see clear differences between many of the models, though not between these top models here. So this is when we combined all of the data, and we could have a lot of power to reject all of the models. Even the GPT-2 model fell significantly short of the noise ceiling here, which is very useful. So toward the conclusion, there's a long history of the use of artificial stimuli and natural stimuli in neuroscience and the behavioral sciences. We think controversial stimuli offer a kind of synthesis between these, where you get the best of both worlds. You get stimuli that are powerful for model adjudication, but that also have many features of natural stimuli and drive these higher level representations in visual models. So methodological conclusions: neural network models promise mechanistic explanations of brain information processing, but theoretical progress requires new methodology for comparing hypermetric neural network models. Model comparative inference that generalizes across experimental conditions and subjects enables progress toward better theories, and optimized experiments using controversial stimuli provide severe tests of out-of-distribution generalization performance for different deep-net models. And that's a way to really elicit these different inductive biases that even these very rich models do have. So, and the neuroscientific conclusion is that the primate brain may combine elements of discriminative and generative inference in a still mysterious algorithm. So Ralph and Doris talked about elements of this algorithm, and I think sort of broadly, all of our results point in the direction of generative mechanisms. But it's also important to note that analysis by synthesis is an old idea, and it's not the dominant paradigm in computer vision. So it's not easy to really pull this off, and I think the primate brain still has some mysteries to teach us. So I think this mysterious algorithm combines the computational efficiency of the discriminative approach, rapid amortized estimates at low energetic cost, and the statistical efficiency of the generative inference approach that gives us deep generalization with limited amounts of data. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico, for the thought-provoking presentation. We have lots of questions.
So I want to distinguish between the controversial comparisons and the adversarial. So in traditional, AlexNet, adversarial examples are given by adding small random values and then trying to get it to do a different discrimination. Have you tested that on your models?
Yeah, so we're interested in that as well. And actually, the lack of adversarial robustness is also a concern for the use of controversial stimuli, because you might imagine that it's very easy to get two models to disagree by making just slight adjustments that are imperceptible to people, right? So in that case, you would get stimuli that reject both of the models, right? And actually, that's what we often get, right? So we're in an interesting situation where with controversial stimuli, we have a very powerful hammer, but it can just destroy all of your models, and then you're back to square one, right? So, but that is something that we're very, very interested in.
Great talk, Nico. So I have this question about, apart from the divide between discriminative versus generative networks, also apart from the argument about too simple, too complex. I don't think that neural networks are too simple to mimic the brain function, and I don't think the brain is too complex for that. I agree on that front. But there is an elephant in the room with regarding the major difference between deep neural networks and the brain, and that is the training algorithm and the learning rule. There is this thing called universal approximation theorem, which means if you have a 3-layer neural network with at least 3 layers or more than that, assuming that you have enough hidden units, you can do any transformation, right? Being the input-output function of Socrates, or being the weather patterns, or Netflix movie purchase patterns, whatever you throw at that machine, it absorbs the variance, right? So I've sometimes used the analogy of the dirty sponge, because whatever variance you throw at it, it can absorb it. So in that sense, the fact that deep neural networks can mimic the input-output functions of the brain are not surprising and are not unique to the brain. They can do anything. And on the other hand, on the other side of the story is the learning system that they use, which is backpropagation of error, which is totally non-biological. It's a supervised learning mechanism. It never happens in biology. And that usually goes under the rug with the argument that, well, it gets trained one way or another. Once you have a trained network, you can treat that as a brain. But I am afraid that changing the learning rule from backprop to HEP rule or something more biological require a fundamental change in the architecture of the network or something like that to make it brain-like. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, these are major concerns, and you're right. They deserve a lot of thought. So the first one about universal approximation is actually key to my argument here, right? So the key thing there is, it's true, you can have a universal function approximator. It can be nothing like the brain. It can be trained on a large amount of data and can approximate that function and do very well predictively, but only until you test it out of distribution, then it will fail, right? One thing. Consider it just as an intuition pump, what are the actual computer vision models? They're not 3-layer neural networks, despite the fact that 3-layer neural networks are universal function approximators, right? And that has to do with robust generalization performance
and local minimums.
Necessary.
Because when you make the network deeper, you avoid local minimums. It makes it easier to train. So that also becomes an engineering nuance more than modeling the brain function.
A shallow network is also easy to train. I think it has to do with having the right inductive bias, right? So if you are worried about universal function approximation, the answer in my mind is out of distribution evaluation, where you can sort out all of these methods that have, a wildly wrong inductive bias. And there still is an inductive bias implicit to these models, right? And regarding backpropagation, that's fascinating, and I think also wide open. Of course, for a long time, computational neuroscientists have thought about all kinds of learning algorithms, and all of that work, it's still a very active field, and it continues to be very active. I think we need to distinguish between the goal of modeling the computations, perceptual computations, for example, and learning. So in my lab at the moment, we are not studying learning. We consider backpropagation a hack for setting the parameters of our models. We do not consider it as a model of the learning process, and we wouldn't make claims like that, right? But I also agree with you that ultimately these things could interact with each other. If we have better models of learning, we might have different architectures and also better models of the perceptual computations.
Thank you.
Yeah, great talk. I have a question. So, there are more and more studies show that large language models are extremely sensitive to different prompts. For example, if you perturb one word in the prompt, then it will produce a very different probability distribution of the words. It seems to prevent a robust design of the controversial sentences. So, what's your opinion for that?
Can you rephrase the question?
So I mean, because the language models are extremely sensitive to the exact words in the prompt, so it seems like maybe some naive change in the prompt can lead to very different probability distribution in the language models. And I think it presents a kind of problem to the robust design of the controversial sentences. Yeah,
Yeah.
because as long as if you change one word in the sentence, it can produce very different probability.
Yeah, so of course if you change one word in a sentence, it can also have a very different meaning, or it can be very much less likely to occur in natural language. But I think you're probably right that these models in some way are brittle and suffer from some of the same drawbacks that vision models suffer from, even though the adversarial perturbations take a different form in that context because it's a discrete input space. Right? I don't know what the solution to this is, but I agree with you that this is an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Let's take a question in the back here, and then Doris.
Hey, I was a bit confused about your usage of the word mechanistic, specifically in this context. It seemed to me like I understood the way that these examples are able to make us differentiate performance between models and are able to show how well each model can learn different sets of problems. But I'm wondering, is this supposed to be a tool towards understanding the way biological systems work? Specifically, like, are these models supposed to show the exact mechanisms in which, like, the visual cortex is going to work at recognizing images, or is this a tool towards designing better neural networks that are going to be able to learn better, or is this just a way to sort of test what is already existent out there in the field?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I think there's sort of two related parts to kind of new developments. One is cognitive computational neuroscience, which I talked about, which is about making better models and mechanistic models of human perception and cognition and motor control. So the goal is to model the biological system. And then there's neuro AI, where it's about taking inspiration from neurobiology and neuroscience in order to build better AI. And that's the other side of the coin, and those two are obviously very closely related. And your first question about the definition of mechanism, that is really wide open. There's a lot of philosophical thought about what do we mean by a mechanistic model. Would it have to be at a particular level of description? For example, does it have to involve synapses? Does it have to involve spikes? Does it have to involve different types of neurons, right? So every scientist falls in love with a particular level of description, but one person's mechanism is another person's phenomenology, and some philosophers argue that mechanism should not be defined at a particular level of description, but you can have mechanistic models at many levels of description. And this would suggest that it's sort of up to our field to negotiate and empirically clarify what the right level of abstraction is for having a mechanistic model. And so like a key thing that to me seems essential to the notion of mechanism is this ability to make radical out-of-distribution predictions, as in technology, where you invent something that has never existed in the world, and then usually there's a lot of iteration required, but you can make it exist and it works, right? That's an incredible confirmation that you had an understanding of the elements that you brought together to make this contraption, right? And so I think that kind of notion of mechanistic understanding has to be injected into our definition of mechanistic model, but it's really an open discussion. I think, I don't have the full answer to that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, last question.
I think you actually just answered it. I was going to ask you to say more about what your vision of success is. When will we know that we actually have figured out the brain? And it sounds like if we can make some radical out-of-distribution generalization that we never would have expected. Is that right? Or? Yeah,
I think that's a big part of it. If we have sort of models for many different cognitive tasks that explain brain activity dynamics as well as behavior, and detailed patterns of brain activity dynamics and detailed patterns of behaviors, such as which particular stimuli are people more likely to make an error on, and what is the reaction time across individual stimuli and things like that. If we make detailed predictions like that, and they're at the level, at a similar level to using other subjects as a model of a given subject, then I think for that limited task, we might have a model that captures the mechanism.
So there's another way to compare a model to behavior, and that is by damaging it and seeing whether the pattern of degradation of behavior in, say, the model is similar to a lesion in the human brain. Mm-hmm. And have you thought about that sort of approach?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's also key. And a beautiful feature of the models is that you can damage them at will, right? And you can design experiments for damage, right? You could find the kind of damage that leads to the most easily measurable consequences, for example, in behavior, and that would allow you to more efficiently, experimentally test these different models.
Okay. Let's thank Nikos for inspiring this. Okay, we will